Welcome to Beyond the Platform. I'm your host, Tony Montgomery, and with us today we have Killian Hamilton, one of the coaches and lecturers for the Prescript crew, also a lifter and a bobsledder as well. Former bobsledder, once a bobsledder, always a bobsledder.
I think it's once a bobsledder, hopefully never a bobsledder. So
That's I love that sport, man. I love the fact that they give you the exact criteria that you have to hit, like a combine, to actually like make it onto the team. And then from there, it's like, then you just got to earn your spot each and every way you go.
yeah, that's the crazy part of it. You go and, like you said, there's all these set criteria in the combine that you can achieve. And then when you actually go to push a bobsled, all that stuff is null and void.
Right.
Maybe there's some transfer there, probably not. And it's funny because every country has different criteria.
Yeah.
There's countries that do the complete opposite of what we do in North America, and they're crazy fast. So it's funny. Yeah, you kind of earn your spot to earn your spot again, which is good though,
It
because
is good, right? Because you're constantly trying to earn your spot. So you're never resting on your laurels, which I think is good because when I think of it in terms of like the military, once you get into the military, you can kind of rest on your laurels and still make it up the ranks because after a certain amount of time, you just naturally get promoted. You don't have to be an overachiever. You don't have to worry about people coming for you, but with something like that, where you're constantly getting inundated with new young talent looking to want to start. Same thing with like NFL or other leagues, right? It's like you're constantly having to work. You can't just rest on your talent, which is great. I think it's a great way to do things, but it's also an extremely stressful way to do things.
yeah, it's easily the most stressful period in my life. And, I played other sports at, a relatively high level, provincial and national levels for rugby. And, I ran track in high school, competed at powerlifting at all kinds of different levels. And then when I went out to do bobsled, like you said, I'd never been in an environment where I was actively trying to be usurped every day,
Yeah.
or usurp someone else. Right. And that's the thing with powerlifting too. The big discrepancy coming from powerlifting into attempting bobsled was in powerlifting, you do a meet, who kind of beat you at the meet. Then you go back to the gym and you're all alone and you can kind of go about your own devices for, 6-9 months till you have to see someone again. In bobsled, you got to see that guy at lunch, at dinner. You got to see him at the track. You have to see him in the gym, and you're
Yeah.
constantly evaluating yourself against human beings every moment of the day. And it was just an environment where there are no breaks, right? You're in a sled
Right.
28, 29 days out of the month. So
I
yeah,
could
you're
only
constantly,
imagine the amount of like insecurities, inadequacies that could breed in a human being, right?
yeah. And like we've met, I'm not the biggest guy in the whole world, maybe five,
Right.
5'8", 100, I was 178 pounds maybe when I went to do bobsled, and bobsledders are all 100 kg, 5'11", six
They're
foot.
thick. Yeah, they're big
They're
boys.
big dudes. And so I was trying to run a 40 and gain exponential amounts of weight while still running the same 40 I did when I went to the combine. And yeah, you're looking at guys, you walk into the gym and guys are just benching, 3 plates for sets of 10 for speed on
Right.
an off day, right? And you're like, well, this is the baseline that I have to achieve here now.
Yeah, that's interesting, man. Did how like because people see bobsled and they don't really. I mean, I have to imagine people understand there is some technical prowess to it, but I feel like they don't fully comprehend it, right? They think like you just push it. I've seen cool run-ins. They just push it and then you just go down this slide and it's really fun. You don't really do much, right? I know each position has different technical things that they have to do. What position did you do and how like technically inundated is those type of things?
So I was a brakeman in a 2-man sled. So once we jumped in the sled, my job was to just hang on and pull the brakes at the very end. So little technical responsibility was thrown my way. But on the pilot side, like I never piloted a sled, but just the sheer amount of cognition and necessary for a pilot, and the ability to be even keel under stress to memorize the turns of a track, because you can't see anything, right? Roughly your forehead might be over top of the sled as you go down. So
Yeah.
you have to memorize every turn, which direction, how many pressure zones, is it high, is it low, when to back off, when to pull. And then for me in the brakeman position, like your head's between the legs, you're holding onto the sides of the sled. And the first time you go down, you don't really realize you have to stabilize your head. So you probably rattle off the sides of the sled the entire way down. You vomit when you get out. Well, at least I did. And then you realize you're like, oh, I actually have to like protect my head as I go down. But little to no technique in the brakeman side of things, tons of technique in the pilot side. But when it comes to like loading a 4-man is when like the timing and the camaraderie really comes in, because to try and get 4 guys that size into a toboggan is a technical pursuit in and of itself.
I can only imagine, man. And how fast are these things going?
Whistler is probably the fastest track in the world still, and I know we got over 140 kilometers an hour.
Okay, I don't know what that means.
I
What does
know.
that mean in miles per hour?
Give me a second, right?
100. It sounds fast when you say it like that, but I'm
Absolutely.
assuming it's not close to 140 miles per hour. Is it? Is it less or more?
Less. It would be 92 miles an hour.
Jesus Christ.
Which is
That
still
is
pretty fast.
so fast, man. Yeah, I couldn't imagine having to have the intrinsic ability to memorize the course, map it out in your head while your adrenaline's like through the roof, and then navigate that. That's insane.
Yeah, and it's like it's -20, -30. You're in a you're in a singlet basically. You're just like stimmed out your nut, and someone just slapped you right on the back of the head, and then you basically run a 40 and then jump into an F1 car. So it's the best way I can describe it. It's pretty insane.
It sounds insane, man. I think they should like, how they have like simulators for skydiving. They should have a
Yeah.
simulator for that. That'd be fucking wild.
Yeah, if you got into a shopping cart and your 3 biggest friends hit you with a baseball bat, that would essentially be the bobsled
At
simulator.
90 miles an hour.
Miles an hour, yeah.
Oh man. So the reason I wanted to have you on was you're coaching a course at Prescript, and I've gone through the level 1, and I can't say enough good things about the course. So I was just wanting to get you on to talk about the idea of the course that you're teaching, what it entails. I know it launches in January, and it's a course on skill acquisition. So if you could just give like a brief synopsis of what the course actually entails, because I mean, that's a very broad subject base, right? Like, who is that the course designed for? What do they get out of it? That type of thing.
Yeah, so it's something I get to explain every day, which is great. So the course is called Skill Acquisition. Now, my intent for the course is it becomes a practical approach to motor unit learning. So that being said, I think when we look at strength and conditioning, we often neglect the idea that there is a large element of motor unit learning put behind it, and it's in the different mechanisms behind motor unit learning and skill acquisition that we've seen used, the constraints method, other things like that, cognitive, associative, autonomous means, sensory motor, and visuomotor feedback. We see in other fine and major motor skill sports or tasks that we use these models of skill acquisition to develop prowess and technique and efficiency. And I think we can take a lateral approach to applying those in the weight room, especially even behind a barbell. And in doing so, if we understand how someone learns, we can understand how to expedite the learning process and also delineate any type of relative fatigue or injury management that may be necessary along the way.
Yeah, no, I like that. Sounds like it's going to be super valuable. Now, in terms of like creating the criteria for it, there's a lot of ideas of how motor learning is done. Did you guys structure it based off a certain principle? Like, was it off of Bernstein's principle? Was it off of Piaget's principle? Like, how did you guys structure that, or what in your mind makes the most sense for the actual structure of motor learning?
Yeah. So what we did is coming out of the L1 course that you took, and Shallow's kind of approach behind mobility, stability, and strength, I looked to basically overlay like the Fitz-Posner model of cognitive associative autonomous, seeing that when we look at like alphanumeric exercise selection and strength and conditioning, we can almost map both models over top of one another, seeing more coordination or stability-based exercise that may occur early on in a strength or a powerlifting program really look to manage more of like the cognitive inputs necessary. So things like hip airplane, single leg RDL, bottoms up kettlebell press, all enact a more neurological change in the body, allowing them to be more cognitive, understanding joint relationships, understanding stability and center of mass. Looking at the associative column, associative is always going to be sports specific. So associative to your sport. In powerlifting, it would be the competition lifts. Now, when we program competition lifts, we look to drive neurological adaptation to a fault before physiological adaptation. We're not going to take the low bar squat to be a quad hypertrophy exercise. We're going to take it to a level of technical breakdown and move on from it to something that's autonomous, something that's either externally stabilized or lower end neurological output. And then we can drive physiological change from there. So as we attenuate neurological and physiological output, we can bias the skill uptake in either category.
And the goal of that is to do that within each training session, or to do that block by block? Do you do cognitive, associative, autonomous within the sessions, or do you do a cognitive block, an associative block, and then an autonomous block? How are you setting it up? How are you designing that?
Yeah, so I look in this course to help people understand how it can be implemented on a per session and per block basis.
Mm-hmm.
And then even more on like a mesocycle basis of understanding, like you said, depending on the lifter, the sport, and then in or out of season, we could see blocks of training be the majority autonomous work. So we might see a huge attenuation in volume or frequency to associative or cognitive work, and a big overload into the autonomous section. Now, as we arrive closer to, say, a peaking block, as we arrive closer to in season, we might see that associative phase take over in its priority and the autonomous section of work fall off. So the goal is to understand how it could be implemented on a per session basis. But I almost think at this point, we see that often and it's very pedestrian. And what we don't manage for is adaptive decay over the frequency of someone's training cycle. So looking at allostatic load, ability to adapt to stimulus, we're not taking into account, like, say, the cost to the athlete of cognitive, associative, autonomous work over a block, over a week, even over a mesocycle, of really where are we kind of catching that wave in allostatic load to peak to see these adaptations, and how can we then manage these categories to back someone off or perform high frequency deloads in training.
Yeah, I like that. Now, could you explain allostatic load a little bit more so people have a better understanding of what that is?
Yeah, great. So I think the easiest way to understand allostatic load is just understanding stress as an aggregate. So if stress was sand and rocks and anything like that mixed together, those are aggregates. They're separate, but they become a whole. Now, when we look at stress, and you and I have talked about this a bunch as well, nutrition is a stress, sleep is a stress, work's a stress, training is a stress.
Life, right?
Life in general is a stress, especially now when we're recording this podcast. So understanding that with an athlete, those external means of stress are going to contribute to allostatic load, which could be visualized as almost this wavelength in which we're catching peaks of adaptations and then values of almost detraining. So understanding we need X amount of stress to drive adaptation. But at the same time, when that peak level of adaptation is hit, this is where we see people deload, is there's a need to back off on that stress and let someone recover. So in looking at allostatic load, I think it's a wavelength or a representation that needs to be placed over top of training, understanding that neurological and physiological adaptation or exercise is each going to have equivalent costs. And we're going to need to balance volume between those categories. You're going to have to balance volume between your hypertrophy and your strength work in terms of frequency or in terms of your intensity. And depending on where you are in a block of training or a year, you're going to drive intensity to one, but you can't just go RPE 8 on all exercises every day of the week, right? So intra week, like in a single week of training, you actually may be able to map out almost this high frequency deload to the athlete by manipulating the modality used. So moving someone from a barbell, more competition style lift to something in an autonomous category at the end of the week that marks the same biomechanical markers, but not at the same adaptation to intensity, right? So someone might be moving from a low bar squat on a Monday or Tuesday. They might be moving into a dumbbell walking lunge on a Friday, lower into the workout. Now they're still going to be driving hip flexion, external rotation, abduction, forward trunk, anti-rotation, all the biomechanical markers we look for in a good low bar squat. But now just changing the modality to dumbbell, moving it to, say, a D or E class, we're driving like motor unit recruitment, far lesser absolute load to the athlete.
So you're taking into account more the stimulus fatigue ratio of exercise selection to drive adaptation, which is a great way to look at it for sure, because stress management is all we do as program designers, right? And that's a day-to-day thing, and it's something that needs to be varied. But when you're doing that, if the idea is to acquire skill within the movement pattern that you're doing, if they're constantly getting to this over fatigue state, by the time they get to the lunges or something like that, they're not able to acquire that skill. How do you balance which exercises to prioritize within the scheme of like the periodization program within the year? Like, are you finding that specificity should always be there, that should reign supreme, or with the idea of skill acquisition, as long as you're working within those same movement patterns, you can adjust the load to create similar adaptations within the body structure without having to do low bar squats year round?
Yeah, so that's a big thing that I experimented this entire year with, especially with the what we know to be the volatility of trying to get into a gym nowadays, especially in
Right.
Canada. I was experimenting with understanding like capacities and end ranges. So understanding if my bench press is a horizontal expression of my capacity through, you know, degrees of shoulder flexion, it's can I start to develop like cues in, say, vertical pulling movements that are then going to be able to be transposed into a horizontal pushing movement. That way I can greatly attenuate like the concentric loading, but I can overload like the eccentric time I'm in the movement. Now we know if we look at pull-ups, especially from like a gymnastics point of view, or like even with your history in the military and like the amount of pull-ups you have to execute, like there is at the end of the day a skill involved in being efficient in it and finding this ability to overpronate, depress, anti-laterally flex, drive elbows into, you know, abduction or a scap, you know, into scaption or the scapular plane, keep them close to your rib cage, adduct them. We can find, you know, a great deal of efficiency in overhead pulling movements. Now, when we take those same mechanics, those same shapes from vertical to horizontal, sit down on a bench, well, now you're externally stabilized. Now you're in a horizontal plane, so a lesser degree of instability at the shoulder. You can express far greater efficiency and force because you overloaded the eccentric range of the shoulder. Now we can look at that as finding like shapes, but not necessarily looking at it in a pedestrian way of like a horizontal pull is a horizontal push, because I don't actually think those go together. I think vertical pulling patterns will contribute opposite to horizontal pushing patterns more. And I think what you could take from the L1 that you took is understanding those biomechanical markers in movement and now applying them, like you said, in a program where I'm not going to be overloading, say, a said movement for a like adaptation, but I'm going to be finding equivalent markers in movement, going like when I'm in hip flexion, I want to see external rotation abduction. Well, I'm not always going to be able to hit low bar, high bar squat, but I can hit lunges for distance at the end of the workout. Maybe not on the day that I squat, but on a Friday. So I have 4 days in between, but I'm finding like shapes in movement again, or the same biomechanical markers.
Yeah, I think that's important to fully understand the biomechanics of each lift and the function of each muscle, right? Because a lot of people have this idea or notion that push pull could be in a very effective way to train. But it's like, well, if you look at the lat and you look at the pec, they're very similar in actually what they do. So if you're doing pec movements, superset it with some type of lat movement, you're actually creating this inability to stabilize within your, and then it's like, well, then you have pec injuries. And it's like, yeah, if you don't know how things actually correlate together, then you're going to be programming in a manner that decreases your ability to put output into something, increases your fatigue, which is going to usually lead to some type of injury.
Yeah, and then that's what we see is we see like these drivers of fatigue are oftentimes, you know, exertion markers in training and not necessarily like technical criteria. And I think if we look at any type of sport specificity or competition, like we go back to powerlifting with squat, bench, and deadlift, those are examinations of your ability to execute, right? Like when you low bar squat, when you bench press, when you deadlift, you're finding, you know, these structural A to B straight lines to be efficient in strength. You're not necessarily finding what could be this, you know, very curved line of function around it. So I think if we looked at training the squat, bench, and deadlift solely to technical criteria of efficiency, and then using, like you said, the massive toolbox we have of exercises that actually implement, you know, the appropriate challenge to the muscle groups, well, we're going to be able to drive physiological fatigue through function, which is adaptation through musculature, and we're going to leave compensation to sport. If we compensate at a far lesser volume than we adapt, we're going to stay safe. And I think we often drive compensation to its limit when we look at rates of exertion versus, you know, technical criteria to be appeased.
For sure. That makes a ton of sense, because the idea of adding variation into your movement patterns to create this idea of less wear and tear. It's like wear and tear doesn't come, like you're still bending your knees, you're still squatting, you just have a different bar on your back. Do you think that that's going to elicit less wear and tear? I would have to say that the variations elicit more wear and tear because you don't have the skill acquisition to perform those movements, right? But when it comes to the idea of like skill acquisition for specific movements, you want to create autonomy within that movement pattern as much as possible, because if you're thinking of 5 different cues within an exercise, you're fucked from the beginning, right? You're not going to be able to execute anything because you're overthinking. So how do you go about programming that in to make sure that they're as efficient as possible? Maybe taking along the lines of a frequency or a volume workers or something like that, because everyone has this idea of skill acquisition takes X amount of lifts to get it done. And whatever that is for the person, they have to attenuate that before they can actually say that they've acquired that skill. And then is there a fear in your mind of this overuse injury, as long as you're not, I guess if you're not in your mind, if you're not compensating, is there wear and tear, right? How do you think about the wear and tear with specificity dynamic when you're trying to acquire skill?
Yeah, so a big thing I've gotten into, and I want to get out of the habit of using this word, but I keep saying like perturbation and movement is kind of like the nucleus of this idea of skill acquisition. And what I mean by that when we look at barbell lifts is that if everything starts at the core, what happens outside of it is like a distal challenge to the proximal stability of the core. Now, I believe that I think there's more than the transverse plane. Like I'm going to go with, that we have sagittal, we have transverse, we have, like we work through rotation, we work through anti-lateral flexion, we work through flexion extension. So when I look at the big 3 lifts, I look at the squat in its base state as an anti-rotational movement. I look at the bench press as an anti-lateral flexion movement. And I look at the deadlift as an anti-flexion extension movement, which probably makes the most sense. Yeah. But I look at them in this way as, what is the first to fail? Oftentimes it's the core, especially in squat and deadlift. Rarely do we see, a lifter maybe outside of squatting in the elite level whose quads fail at what they're lifting. Like we see upper backs round, we see lower backs round. Or we see people start to windmill. Twist. And that's anti-rotation, right? That's the shoulder not being stable to find an effective position of the lat to stabilize the core, to allow the oblique and QL to do what they do, to then allow, the glutes to do what they do. So I look at variations of squat or hip flexion as challenges to anti-rotation. I look at the bench press as a challenge to anti-lateral flexion. And this one seems kind of weird, but if we think about the idea that you're under greater need to depress the lats than retract the shoulder blades in your bench press, depending on grip width, much of the retraction of the scapula happens sympathetic to literally lowering a weight to your chest. You're going to get movement of the scap.
Right.
So it's going to happen. You don't have complete control, but it's your ability to anti-lateral flex. It's your ability for those obliques to stabilize that rib cage in an upward position and not cave, right? We see people's chest cave in bench press, but we really see the rib cage cave because that core can't keep the rib cage in a stable position. So I would go anti-lateral flexion is a base level perturbation to bench press. And I would look at flexion extension at lumbar thoracic being the first thing to give, and really any deadlift we see fail.
Right.
So I think, like you're saying, is how do you stay away or how do you not fear the overtraining of someone, is to look at the lift in itself as being a perturbation to one of those core tenets of stability. So training someone's squat accessory, not through a need to flex the knee more, but through challenges to rotation, training the assistance to someone's deadlift through challenges to flexion extension, and finding a gradient and a slow pace in which you start to increase the volume of the main lifts. Like with the beginner lifter, why don't they hit, 2 top sets, 1 top set of squat for 5 reps with good technique, test it, and then drive massive amounts of volume into the autonomous phase, which we know is hypertrophy, and they're probably going to greater uptake in stimulus from physiological change than that initial neurological change in base level athletes, right? And I know this from being a lightweight powerlifter. Like I started powerlifting when I was 18, I was 146 pounds. I met Paul, I weighed in at 149, I think. But I'd trained for 7 years, never put a pound on, because all I did was train my nervous system to execute efficiently under a bar. And being that small, I ended up tearing an oblique. Well, I had no physical adaptation beneath the bar to ensure my ability to keep going, right? So I think with beginner lifters, we can keep the associative work next to no volume and increase it slowly and gradiently. And then we can start to divide single day volume over multiple days to create frequency, but we're always dividing parts of a whole. If we just look at programs and we see this program's got 1 day of squat, this program's got 4 days of squat, it's like, well, where'd you get all that squat volume from? It didn't come from anywhere. You've just chosen to put it in there. But
right.
If we could adapt, week 1 is 2x5, week 2 is 3x5, week 4 is 4x5, week 5 is 2x5 on Monday, 2x5 on Thursday. We're now dividing parts of a whole. And you as a programmer or a coach or an athlete, you have this better understanding of where the volume is coming from and can I adapt to that? Now, we start to add that volume again over greater frequencies, and then we can start training at a high volume and a high frequency. We could then divide that initial volume of the classic lift into volumes of, like you said, variation into other lifts. But I'm always accumulating volume from 0 to a number in which I can divide over multiple days to a higher frequency. And that higher frequency approach, I can divide into greater variation.
Interesting. That seems like that would be the antithesis of a lot of people, how they do things. You see with beginner lifters, it's like high frequency from the beginning, not too many accessories, because skill acquisition is the most important part. And you're kind of saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but skill acquisition is important, but injury prevention by not having these patterns to compensate is going to drive you create more longevity within your career. So you're more focused on fixing those patterns before they even start and getting really strong, and then build frequency after that. So instead of having a regression model, you kind of start with the regressionary stuff so that you're constantly progressing. Would you say that that's a decent way to sum that up, or?
No, yeah, I would agree with you entirely. And that's kind of like, I had this discussion last week on a call where I was saying, like, we all see these memes every day on Instagram. I got to turn off Instagram, but like, I see so many times where people go, progress isn't linear. And I argue that it is, but I argue that we look at progress through like a toilet paper roll. So nothing seems linear because we see the ups and downs as they occur. Now, if I wanted to invest in my retirement, I'd put money in today and I would thoughtfully not check on that money until I retired. And if I had more money at the end, then I would have progressed linearly because I wasn't there for any of the sticking points. Now, if we look at this progress on like a high frequency RPE scale of hitting singles and measuring against ourselves, well, early on in our progress, we're going to see it delineate from that progression where that might not necessarily be what we're trying to progress. If I have a great level of capacity, I always think of capacity as like a big circle. And within that circle, I can draw points of A to B, efficient points of movement through a circle of capacity. We started talking about bobsled at the beginning of this call. Nobody's born to do bobsled. Everybody comes from another sport. Football,
true.
Track and
Very
field,
true.
Rugby. They come from the military all the time. Well, like, look at the sports they come from and the capacity for force production, the capacity for aggression, the capacity for athleticism that's created in these other sports. And then when they're given a modality like a bobsled that runs on a track and they have to push it and jump in, well, they're executing that capacity in an associative sense. Their ability to, again, take that vertical to horizontal vector and express force is greatly improved, right? You got guys who are in the military and you guys do everything under the sun to be fit for the military. I have a couple of guys that are SEALs that I coach, and it's like writing the programs for them is stressful. I can't imagine doing the program.
Right.
I don't look at any more of this PE stuff, man. It's terrifying. But you express that capacity in a very linear fashion. Well, you're not even getting close to touching the edges of what you can do. And I think when we get into powerlifting and we see the barbell as this be all and end all, we don't build capacity around it. And the minute something goes wrong under the bar, there's no capacity to fix it. And I think what may seem like progression at the beginning, I think is sometimes a false positive or a lost profit in ways when it comes to strength training.
For sure. I mean, neurological adaptation is going to be the biggest driver, but that doesn't necessarily attenuate long-term progression, right? And you're saying if you have the stones in place, right, having a more realistic long-term viewpoint, you're going to be able to naturally progress it may be a slower progression, right? Everyone wants to add 100 pounds to their total every time they do a meet, but those people are also getting injured left and right because they don't, and their lifts look like shit because they don't have that capacity. I always tell people, if you can make it through the sport for 10 years, then you'll be strong, right? But it takes that type of long-term commitment to get there. And I do agree with you. Like if you're putting things in place and you're not progressing in the manner that you think that you should, right? But you're progressing in the manner that you're actually capable of, you're going to not attenuate these injuries. And then you're going to actually have linear progression. Someone like an Ed Cohen, for example, I think he's progressed his entire career, and people will be like, well, he's the GOAT, so he can do that. And it's like, well, there's a lot of people who do that. Yuri Belkin has progressed constantly. Like all these guys are continuing to progress at such high levels. So to think at the intermediate to novice level that you can't progress, like that you've hit your genetic potential, is just silly, right?
Yeah, and I think like in a big token, like I like that you brought up Ed Cohen, because I remember reading some program that Ed Cohen got infamous for on the internet. That wasn't even his own program. He wrote it for a strong.
That's how it always is, man.
Right? But it's like when we looked at it, and when I look at it, and I look at like the way Yuri trains, and like I know we see Yuri just pull sumo all the time, but like you look at the way Ed trained, it's perturbation and movement. Like he went through time, distance, and load as variations to the competition lifts. He wasn't doing, and maybe he thought he was, but he wasn't doing seated military press because it made his shoulders stronger. It's because he's pressing maximal load through a more unstable plane of movement. The load he's going to be able to press is attenuated. So his recovery is going to be higher because he can't drive the same absolute load. The range of motion is greater. So he's getting stronger through a distance in which he's not going to have to press through. And the vertical plane of movement of the shoulder is far harder for you to exert force upon than a horizontal vector of force. So when he takes a 405 behind the neck press and moves it to an arched bench press with Ed Cohen size hands and arms, well, now horizontal bench press for him is like the hammer strength machine. But that's a perturbation of movement, right? He took a horizontal plane of movement and he changed the challenge to it to be more distally unstable than his competition style training. It's Dan Green at a seminar saying that before he got into powerlifting, when they did weightlifting, they never pulled off the ground. Everything was an RDL. And we look at Dan Green explode like probably 10 years ago when I got into powerlifting with, pulling sumo, pulling conventional, pulling deficit in the same session. And like, this better than anybody. It's like, guy's got a back made of, I don't know, adamantium, but maybe that's because the perturbation of movement created direct capacity to a competition lift, right? And then if you can pull conventional deficit 7 plates to flat back, and you go to pull sumo with a 3-inch range of motion, well, there's far less likelihood in your sumo training that you're going to enter into a position where it's ever really going to go wrong unless you program terribly for yourself, because you have that capacity in distance and in time.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So when it comes to the idea of programming these type of movements, how much do you focus on muscle function and how much do you focus on muscle action in the beginning, right? Because the muscle function is going to be completely different than the muscle action a lot of times, right? Being able to isolate a muscle doesn't necessarily lend itself to making you a better lifter in the short term, but it may allow you to become a better lifter in the long term because you're increasing your cross-sectional area of the muscle, you're increasing your ability to connect with the muscle a little bit better. So whenever you are getting cues, things are dialed in a little bit more. So how do you find that balance of function versus action within your programming dynamics?
I think a lot of it comes down to, honestly, initial assessments of athletes and looking at where their baseline stability lies. Now, if I've got somebody who's, squatting 500 pounds, pulling 600, and they go to do a single leg RDL with body weight and they can't, stay on one leg,
right?
That's probably going to be a guy who gets a massive amount of function hidden in his program and little to no muscle action because he's got the muscle action. Squatting 500, deadlifting 6, he has the cross-sectional muscle fiber ability to actually, exert force and obviously, create volume. So that's fine. But the function isn't there. And I know that's what's underpinning that 600-pound squat, right? Like, squat's sitting up on stilts right now. So that's where I kind of create my first assessment of where the function, where the action goes. And then when I have lighter weight athletes like myself, maybe people who are more stable, female athletes, especially who lend to that hypermobile side of things, I'll often load in more muscle action at the very beginning. Like you said, again, just try to create some hypertrophy in the areas that we need hypertrophy in, so we can then kind of build a better base of strength. And then from that hypertrophy, begin to mix in more functional approaches to training. Now, I think when we think about, what is muscle function versus action, sometimes function gets painted with a bad light because we look at like very regressive corrective exercise,
Right.
things we can't load. Now, I just think of going back to those tenets of core stability and going, function is primarily going to move through gait cycle, the way we walk and breathe. And in gait cycle, we begin to suggest rotation or anti-rotation. That'd be a tenet that becomes very prevalent. But there are so many exercises we could take to the absolute house for athletes that would resemble, something that's muscle action or something that we can load and progress, but are going to train the function of the body. Contralateral single arm dumbbell row, like a heavy dumbbell row, keeping stable hips, not allowing yourself to open to the open hip side. Heavy dumbbell row is going to be very much a function exercise, contributing to posterior oblique string stability, glute stability, lat. We could look at, a landmine, like a Meadows row is another amazing functional exercise. Meadows row is great, contralaterally loaded, get into a nice split stance, stack the hips, another posterior oblique sling exercise. Walking lunges are infamous in the bodybuilding community for building huge quads, and there's nothing more functional than a long gait stride loaded walking lunge that's not only going to build strength but function in the hip. And then from the pec side of things, there's so many exercises on the bench side of things that could resemble something an athlete would want to do, but maybe contributes to function. The contralateral half kneeling landmine press, 6 to 8 reps, is very much going to be an exercise that strengthens both posterior and anterior oblique sling, trains upward rotation of the scapula, protraction of the shoulder serratus. You have a guy throw that in at the end of his pressing workout, it's going to resemble more pressing to him, but to you, you're going to kind of know the why behind it. So even if and when I have to load function into a workout, I try and find ways of appeasing the criteria I want to appease, but in a way where that athlete's going to buy into, sending it on the landmine press or sending it on the landmine.
Yeah. For sure, man. That's one of the things that drives me crazy is people don't understand how to create function within the program, right? They think function is only these corrective exercises that we do at the beginning. Next thing you know, they're fucking 30 minutes deep into their warm up and like you haven't even touched the bar yet. But then you look at their accessories and it just says tricep stuff or it just says bicep. They're like, what the fuck are you doing? Like you're missing out on this huge opportunity to eliminate this 30-minute warm up and actually incorporate movements that make sense within that athlete's paradigm of what they need to work on. And it's one of the most frustrating things I see within programming. People are just like bicep curls, like, okay, which one? It doesn't matter. And then what do you think an athlete's going to do when it doesn't matter? They're going to pick like a fucking barbell curl, which is not morphologically like efficient for their pattern. They're going to fuck up their elbows. They're going to fuck up their shoulders. And like, oh, I can't bench. My elbows hurt. It's like, oh, well, what are you doing? Well, I'm doing this. And a bad coach is going to be like, I don't really know what to tell you. Ice it, take some ibuprofen. It's like, take out the fucking barbell curls, you dipshit. Like put in exercises that actually work with the athlete, not to continue to create torque and issues within certain joint patterns. It's like, it just drives me crazy, man.
If there's one, I did a whole lab on this with Prescript where I went off on the exact thing you just said, man, which was seeing the, 100 of your choice. And I'm like, no, man, I pay you to have no choice.
Right.
Why would I want to take, why would I want my choice to matter now? It's like, I would rather see a program that was barbell squat of your choice for 5x5. And then the volume of the work, 100 reps was programmed. Who cares what they do for 25? Care what they do for 100 reps.
Right. Yeah, it's like the idea of, breath work, right? Like, how do you breathe throughout the day? Because you're doing that every single second of the day. It's like, well, I don't really think about that. Well, it's like, how much dysfunction are you creating by not thinking about these things? Where do you get the most volume from throughout your training? Probably through your accessories. Why aren't you thinking about those, right? It's just, I don't know. It's just something that's lacking a lot within the actual realm of coaching, especially for strength athletes. At least bodybuilders fucking understand a little bit more about exercise selection and the dynamics between the two. But in strength athletes, it's just like, doesn't even cross their mind.
No. And then because I think that, and you touched a good point on there, like, man, we were in Tampa, me and Shallow, and I saw some bodybuilders who don't have a clue, but
That's
powerlifting,
true.
in powerlifting, it gets worse because powerlifting is very quantitative, right? The beauty of bodybuilding and somehow how they have this air of almost overt intelligence over what they do is the qualitative sense, right? It's the muscle belly and the fullness and the striations, the separation, whatnot. They're constantly doing 9 different exercises for their pec, and they kind of hit on a few that matter. But in powerlifting, it's all quantitative. It's like,
Yep.
well, if I can't move weight in this, I'm going to go do the thing I can move weight in, or I'm going to just go move more weight because it's quantitative. We get scored on the quantitative quality of our performance. And it becomes very unfortunate. And a big thing I always say, like me and Shallow always laugh, is I'm like, shit doesn't matter until it matters.
True.
Like, man, is that true about anything that happens under a barbell? Because you and I see it, and you even mentioned it here. It's like, man, we see guys that are crazy strong and their totals go up 100 pounds at a time and none of it matters. It's like, well, that guy's knees cave. And it's like, well, does it matter? He squats 900. And it's like, doesn't matter today.
So
It really
true,
doesn't
man.
matter today, but it's definitely going to matter tomorrow.
Yeah.
And it's just unfortunate because our drivers of performance have sat in, quantitative means for so long. And that's kind of what I'm hoping with, looking at the lateral thought process behind skill acquisition and looking at, like shapes and perturbations to this core stability model and integrating function into exercises that really matter, is understanding that all we need to do is test when we need to test, and testing and training are very different.
Yeah.
And you never train how you test. I was never very good in school, but the way I studied for an exam was never to just do the exam 9 times.
Right.
Probably given a textbook that told me a lot of stuff I never needed to know. So when it came time to doing the exam, I only needed to know one of the 2 things. So I think we neglect that in training, where we go for a test and then test model again.
Yeah. No, that makes sense, right? The whole idea of training leads up to the one day where you actually have to test it. But I don't know if it's insecurity within lifters. I don't know what it is, but they're always chasing this idea that they need to build confidence within the program. And that to them, the only way they build confidence is to handle the weight that they want to handle at the meet. And it's like, it just doesn't make any sense, right? It's like, if you're moving your opener, like at your last warm up, how is that not confidence enough for you? Like, why do you need to touch your second and third attempt, right? Like, you should know that by the way certain things are moving, you have the confidence to move the other things. Why do you want to create so much systemic fatigue that you're never going to be able to recover? And then you underperform at the meet, which we see all the time. There's so many people that hit these huge totals in the gym, and then meet day comes and they're fried, they're done. They underperform by 100 pounds and they have a whole list of excuses of why they don't do it. And they promise to never make the same mistakes again. And then they fucking make the same mistakes again because they don't understand what's actually causing it.
And I think it's funny because we look at it, like what you're talking about goes directly back to like that allostatic load or that peak adaptation level.
Right.
And when we look at powerlifting, we look at guys, especially in the heavier weight classes, that have high frequency allostatic load, low frequency training model. They train 3 times, maybe 4 times a week, high frequency allostatic load every training session. Like you said, they're going for it. They're sending it. We see bodybuilding, on the other hand, we see a high frequency training style, low allostatic load, because we see these peaks in physiological adaptation that they're chasing happen so rarely. It's not like powerlifting. A guy can hit some relative PR every 4 weeks in powerlifting. He can make it up. In bodybuilding, these guys aren't going to see a physiological change for massive amounts of time. And part of that has to do with, dieting and things like that. But as well as just their training style, they're training 5, 6, 7, 10 times a week. They're seeing this low frequency adaptation due to the high frequency of training. But when they pull back on that training and they drop the barbell because they're getting close to a show and they want their waist to get smaller or something, they go sit on machines. Well, they just attenuated the load by sitting on a machine. That super compensation they've been saving up for 6 months enacted upon itself. We don't see that in powerlifting because guys kind of never get away from the barbell. They get closer to a meet and they get under the barbell even more. And then to build confidence, 3 days out from a meet, they're hitting their second attempt. And then they get to a meet. And what they didn't realize is when they hit the second attempt, they were at the peak of allostatic load. When they got to the meet, they were at the valley. And then all of a sudden the next day, they go to a commercial gym and pull their third, and magically they did it.
Right.
So does not that sound like a wave to you? Your last session was amazing.
A logical wave to me. Yeah.
In the warm-up room, you pulled it. Well, it sounds like a wave of adaptation.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a valid and good point. But to kind of change routes here a little
Yeah.
bit, to get off of the skill acquisition stuff, just from like a sheer coach's perspective, and just trying to learn, right? Like you're being mentored under Shallow right now, right? For the most part. I don't know. Do you have a background in any of the stuff that you're currently doing in terms of like school background? Do you have your PhD? Are you a doctor? Are you doing any of that stuff?
No, man, I'm a carpenter. So I went
All
to
right.
trade school to build high rises. But while I was doing that, I was competing at powerlifting. I went to Westside Barbell, trained with Louis and all them when I was like 19 years old. That was the first certification I ever got. Like they had a
Mine
strength.
too. That was the first
Yeah,
certification
that's
I got
amazing. Yeah.
too.
I was
Yeah.
like, oh man, like I went there for a weekend, got back. I was like, they have a certification. Well, that's what I want to learn how to do. And then in the years since, I've learned what I want to keep from that and what I want to forget forever. But yeah, the first thing I got was like West Side, and I just got certification after certification after that. And no, man, this has been all. It's really just been all like practical knowledge, like I guess being on the tools,
Yeah.
um, and then just competing at a ton of stuff and getting the opportunity to hang out with guys like Shallow, talk to guys like yourself, and it's just sitting around and all like every room I go into, I'm always surrounded by way smarter people, and it's exciting to kind of absorb what they have to say, and then whatever I've decided is my own interest, which seems to be this route of skill acquisition, because it was the easiest way for me to understand when I got into powerlifting was taking what I learned in the trades as my school background and applying it to the gym. And that's what I
Yeah.
did. And I realized it was very much kind of the same order of operations. But no, I have a high school education and I have a welding license and I'm a carpenter.
Perfect. So this is perfect then, because well, it's not because I know you personally and I know you're a creative thinker and you have a lot of your own opinions based off of your ability to read and absorb and take in knowledge. But something that I find to be an issue with a lot of people that are in your situation, right, is that they don't have this background within physiology or whatever it is. Not that that's truly important, but they do find this one person that they mentor under and that they learn under. And then that becomes their dogmatic view on how they see everything. They see everything, like Jordan always says, through gate cycle. Function is gate cycle. So now everyone who studies under Jordan says the same thing without actually thinking outside of that box, because Jordan is the king supreme. Like he's up here, right? So and you're not a great example because you are a free thinker. You do read a lot. So,
Yeah,
but in terms of being under someone like that, right, without the actual credentials yourself, how do you not fall victim to creating this bias towards everything this person says and then just regurgitating that without any actual thought process or creativity within what you're saying? You just become a parrot for what he says without actually truly knowing behind it. Like, how do you overcome that as a coach and athlete?
Yeah, well, I guess like the craziest thing is the way me and Jordan met was by accident. So this is kind of funny because this will tie into this. The way me and Jordan met was by accident. A friend of ours, Jordan Moffat of Bacon and Barbells,
Yep.
introduced us, and he's like, "Oh, do you want to go to dinner with the Muscle Doc?" And I was like, "That guy sounds like a douchebag, man. I'm not going." And then we ended up going to dinner, and he was explaining Prescript to me, and I was already coaching clients at the time using this model that you and I talked about. And I kind of gave it to him. I'm like, "Oh man, like you seem pretty smart. You're a doctor. Like, take a look at this. Tell me what it is." And he was like, "Yeah, it sounds like exactly what we're doing." So then we kind of like started communicating from there. But the biggest thing with the relationship between me and Jordan, and I think this goes for everybody, like you said, that comes out of these dogmatic kind of mentorships, is you have to do. If all you do is learn, if all you do is sit and learn and you don't do yourself, you'll never have a different opinion because you just assume it's correct.
Right.
But it's like, man, there are exercises that Shallow programs and Shallow does that I will roast. I will roast in front of him when we do seminars. I will roast them on the Prescript lab. I'm like, you know what? This exercise, who cares about it? It's ridiculous. Because I also do. And it's like when you train 7 days a week and I want to believe everything Shallow says because he's my friend and I do it. And I'm like, you know what? No,
Yeah.
this is the last exercise I'm going to pick because there's just something to me that's more efficient. And I think it comes from doing. And I think we see people with like these dogmatic underpinnings and these people that that can't get out of maybe somebody else's head. It's from the fact they don't do enough. And it's when I learn information, I think of it like, remember like the old overhead projector in class, and they had like the transparency and they wrote on it with a marker.
Yeah.
Well, I give everything I learn as an overhead projector, and I'm just sitting these transparencies on top of one another, and I'm gathering like data points from everything I learn, and I'm going, okay, I learned mobility, stability, strength. Well, then I see skill acquisition, and I'm like, okay, I can see where skill acquisition lands within this mobility, stability, strength arc. Allostatic load, I throw skill acquisition on top of that, and I go like, oh, peak allostatic load. If we just looked at the geometrical shapes of these models, it's like cognitive and associative lives at the high ends of adaptation. Autonomous data markers live at the low end of adaptation. It's simply a pyramid laid over a wavelength. And it's like I start collecting transparencies, and I just keep like data points from more than one source.
Yeah.
Like I don't even try and remember or learn or put into practice anything until I can apply it to another source.
I like that. Yeah. And it's so true, man, the doing aspect of things, because I see this a lot now that I'm in grad school. There's these people who, they go to class, they get told this is something, or they see that their professor wrote a paper and it's like, oh, this is it. This is the truth. And then they post about it. And it's like, have you ever coached anyone with this at all? Have you ever done any of this? Have you put any of this in practical application? It's like, well, no, but Professor so-and-so said it was good, so I just went with that. It's like, do you not see the fault in that at all, in that logic whatsoever? Like, you don't have your own opinion. You don't have your own thought process to it. You're just blindly putting it out there, not understanding and fully knowing that the professor who put it out there is probably going to be wrong, right? Because we're wrong all the time. So to have such an approach to where you're not actually doing to see if what you're doing is wrong, but just putting it out there blindly, I see that so much. So I love the doing part of that for sure. That makes so much sense, man.
Yeah. And it's like, to me, the thing I always say to people is like, you should have your own beliefs that you're like stalwart and very stubborn about. And for me, I don't shy away from having conversations with people that don't agree with me. Like, it's great. But if I talk to someone who has a differing opinion, I see it as a valuable way of strengthening my own understanding of my own belief I already had, not to believe in what they say. Like, I don't get in arguments to lose. I don't get in arguments to win. I just want to better be able to communicate what I believe. It's like,
true.
The thing I always say to people when I don't want to talk to them anymore is I go, you seem really passionate about it. You're probably right. And it's like, because they probably are, and they can be right and I can be right. But at the end of the day, I think it's understanding that half the time me and Shallow talk, I'm yelling at him. I'm just yelling like, and yeah, and what about this? And half the time he's like, I don't know, man. Like, who knows about half the shit I say? But it's having these discussions with somebody where you can find, again, like data points where I can go like, hey, in my non-PhD level understanding, I go to the gym and I do pull-ups and I don't bench press, and then I bench press 3 plates. What do you think that's about? And then in his understanding, he's like, well, the degrees of the shoulder and external rotation. And I'm like, so am I right or am I wrong? I'm right. All right, let's move on. I'll do the doing part. You do the smart thing. It's like Penn and Teller. I'll be quiet. You talk. I'll do the magic tricks.
I love the idea too, that you guys can both be right. A lot of people don't think that. Everyone thinks someone has to be wrong within a conversation. It's like, who determines what's right or wrong under what context, right? Context is everything. And you don't really get that in a lot of conversations. Super interesting. I don't think I've ever asked this of anyone, but I know that you're an avid reader. And so what are the 3 most impactful books that you've ever read that you would recommend that everyone should read within their lifetime?
Oh man. So this is a good one, because I was thinking about this the other day. I'm so glad you asked. So Neil Postman wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. He wrote it in the 80s as a commentary on media and the book 1984. So he's doing a speech about George Orwell, and he's talking about the 1984 media. So Amusing Ourselves to Death is amazing, and you'll probably deactivate Instagram if you read it. So please read that after you follow me back. And then the next book would be The Human Condition by Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt, The Human Condition, describes as technology improves and progresses, our ability to have human-to-human contact regresses. And I think it's just another good book on doing versus learning. And then the last book would probably be The Outsider by Albert Camus.
Mm-hmm.
And that's got to be my all-time favorite book of ever that I've ever read. I've read it like 100 times. And it's just the idea, like we said, it's just about being stalwart and just, you don't have to be right. But you also don't have to be wrong. It can just be okay.
Yeah. And I like that. Those are two books I have never heard of. The Albert Camus one I've read and I really like. I've read a couple of his books and I think they're all really fascinating stuff for sure. So when it comes to this idea of knowledge versus wisdom, right? And you mentioned that. And I feel like there's been a huge shift in this idea of knowledge is far more important than wisdom, right? And that something that's been shifted within the realm of philosophy, but now it's being shifted in the realm of almost everything that we do. We value people's knowledge more than we value their wisdom. We tend to look at older people and we say, you guys don't know what you're talking about. You're not up with technology. Why would I listen to anything that you say? We, especially within the fitness community, everything now is if you're not backed by evidence, then you don't know what you're talking about, because evidence drives knowledge, which drives innovation. It's like, well, what about wisdom? What about the person who's been doing it for 20 years? What about the person who's lived 50 years of their life and who's been married to the same woman for 40, right? And it's like, do you not want to like ever talk to those people? So why do you think that's a problem within society and within what we do? And why do you think it's drifted that way? And how can we fix that?
Man, I was talking about this the other day with somebody. Like, I love these questions, man. Like, I think wisdom is dying for a lot of the reasons a lot of things are dying off, but it's just the idea that I always make the joke to people, because people will throw research at me all the time. Obviously, like, I'm a carpenter. Let's just be clear about that. But I always say, like, research is for people who can't throw hands. Like, people who can't fight, show you research. Because guess what? If you could fight,
That's so true.
The research says, man, like, who gives a shit about this and that paper from some journal? I'm just going to beat you up if you don't agree with me. I'm going to pull research out of my backpack. And I think that comes down to doing. And from growing up in the trades, I realized, like, man, if you can't hammer a nail and you can't bench at least 100 kg, you just go to the back of the line. And I think that's just a principle we just all need to have. And anybody is allowed to do anything they want, and everyone is capable of so much. But I think there are just tenets of being someone in society of value beyond being able to Google something nowadays. Like, knowledge has become more powerful than wisdom, because knowledge is now easier to accumulate than wisdom is. Back when nobody could go to school and people had to go out and work, wisdom was important, because wisdom was what was easier to get, because you just had to stay alive. Yeah. Knowledge was for few. Now knowledge can be for anyone. Wisdom is for the few. So I think we've seen a shift in not what is more important, but what is more popular. And knowledge is popular because it's ever present and ever available. Wisdom takes work. Wisdom takes doing and staying alive.
But it's superficial knowledge, right? It's not knowledge that they actually use and obtain. It's knowledge to show off that they know something without actually have a deeper understanding, right? And that's where the wisdom does come in, right? It's like this idea that you can look at for your profession, right? Carpentry, like you can look at maybe the latest innovation of this, does X, Y, and Z perfectly. And while you're looking at that, the guys who are doing stuff already put the fucking thing up. And it's like, what's more valuable, right? The person who has 10 years of experience and has figured out ways to troubleshoot things and save time and save injuries, or this computer that you Googled on how to do something. You're watching a YouTube video to figure out how to do something instead of asking the guy who's been doing it for 10 years, right?
Yeah.
It's this idea of like instant gratification, superficial knowledge, superficial conversation that we've fallen victim to because of, like you said, Google, the internet, and things of that nature, where everything's so instantly right in front of us and attainable that we don't really ever have to truly have deep conversations or full understanding of what we're talking about. Because every time somebody argues, I can just Google my argument back at them. It's like, well, what good does that do? Like you said, like if we're in the streets, you can't fucking Google how to fight all of a sudden. You're just gonna get your ass whooped, right? It's the same thing. Like when we're in person talking, you're not going to be able to just get on your phone and Google. I'm going to smack it out of your hand and we're going to have a conversation, and then you're going to be lost, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. And I think like you make a good point. Like knowledge is knowing what to do when everything goes right. Wisdom is knowing what to do when everything goes wrong.
Right.
And I'd much rather be the
Which
latter.
one would you rather have, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, oh, that's how it goes when it goes right. Hey, great. Thanks for the tip, man. But it's like when the ship is sinking, I want the guy who sailed for 50 years.
Right.
Not the
Yeah.
guy who built a boat in his basement. Like, get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's life, right? Like the people that have never had to face adversity, they just had a good, nice life. That first time they have to face adversity, they're fucked. They have nothing, no life skills whatsoever. Yeah. No. Awesome, man. Well, tell people about the skill acquisition. When does it start? All that stuff. How can people sign up for it? And then where can they follow you and get coaching from you as well?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. No, this has been an incredible experience, man. Always love talking to you. If you are interested in taking part in skill acquisition or asking further questions about it, you can go to the pre-script.com website to the courses page and click on the SA logo. Otherwise, you can add me on Instagram at Killian.Hamilton and click the link in my bio. It will take you there. The same link in the bio on my Instagram, Killian.Hamilton, will bring you to multiple opportunities to engage in light conversations like this with myself via consultation, or you can book a consultation for coaching. I work with powerlifting, weightlifting, multi-sport, rotational athletes, and tactical athletes.
How many people book conversations just to have a philosophical conversation with you? Have you ever had that happen yet?
Yeah, probably 3 to 5 a week.
That's when you know you've made it, man. That's a good life.
It's scary though. I've become the guru status. I don't want to get there.
Yeah, the Bikram of Prescript for sure.
It's good this is over the internet, so I can't Bikram anybody back.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah,
that's true. All right, man. Well, I just want to say thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Love talking to you about this stuff. I love to see how passionate you are about this and just learning in general, man. Anyone who's willing to, like, it's so funny. The other day, myself and Ben, we were training with another guy, and he said something about, I just don't have time to read. I don't read a lot because I don't have time to read. I'll listen. I might listen to like a podcast or like Audible, and I look at Ben and he looks at me, and I said, I don't have time not to read.
Yeah. What?
Like, yeah. So the values that you have, I can relate to 100%, man. The fact that you put this stuff as non-negotiables and you do it, I have nothing but respect for that. So I appreciate your time, guys. Check out the Prescript stuff. Everything that they do over there, I can vouch for because they are really smart people, backed by their guru, Jordan Shallow. But love the courses, love what you guys are doing, all the content you put out. So I appreciate that. You're definitely moving the industry forward in the right direction. So definitely value you guys. I appreciate your time, man.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it, Tony.